This hearing of the Subcommittee on the Western Hemisphere, Transnational Crime, Civilian Security, Democracy, Human Rights, and Global Women's Issues is going to come to order. And the title of this hearing is Attacks on U.S. Diplomats in Cuba, Response and Oversight. We have one government panel testifying today with the following three witnesses who are here, and we're grateful for you joining us here today. On behalf of the executive branch, Mr. Francisco Palmieri, who's the Acting Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs, Mr. Todd Brown, Diplomatic Security Assistant Director of International Programs at the Department of State, and Dr. Charles Rosenfarb, who's the Medical Director of the Bureau of Medical Services for the Department of State. Thank you all again for being here on this important topic. There are two goals to the hearing today. The first is to establish the facts and of what has occurred, and the second is to conduct oversight over the conduct and the activities of the United States State Department. Here are the facts as will be testified to today by our panel. In late 2016, staff at the United States Embassy in Havana began complaining of strange noises, and among the descriptions that they complained of, high-pitched beam of sound, incapacitating sound, baffling sensation, akin to driving with windows partially open in a car, or just intense pressure in one ear. At the time of this report, the Post's leadership and the supporting office here in Washington, D.C. viewed this activity as harassment from forces hostile to the United States or to U.S. presence in Cuba. Later, there was information gathered from additional individuals, including some of these, which suggested that the events that led to these complaints actually began as early as November of 2016. The initial events that were reported occurred at diplomatic residences, but later these events occurred at hotels. Individuals first visited the medical unit at the embassy in December of 2016 and January of 2017. From February through April of 2017, there was an evaluation conducted of 80 members of the embassy community. 16 of these were identified with symptoms and medically verifiable clinical findings of some combination similar to what you would see in patients that, quote, have had a mild traumatic brain injury or concussion, unquote. In early July, the Bureau of Medical Services at the State Department convened a panel of academic experts to review case histories and the test results up to that point. And they arrived at a consensus. And the consensus is, and I quote, "The patterns of injuries were most likely related to trauma from a non-natural source," end quote. Later, in August of 2017, the Brain Injury Center at the University of Pennsylvania reevaluated embassy employees that were reporting symptoms. Additional individuals and incidents prior to April 2014 were added to the list of confirmed cases. Subsequently, 2 additional individuals reported exposure in mid-August of last year, and those cases were medically confirmed as well, bringing the total number of cases to 24. While the symptoms may vary, all of the medically confirmed cases, all 24 of them, have described some combination of the following symptoms: sharp ear pain, dull headaches, ringing in one ear, vertigo, visual focusing issues, disorientation, nausea, and extreme fatigue. As we said earlier, the timeline of the reported incidents are as follows. The initial wave that were reported in December may have begun as early as November of 2016, and they occurred through late March of 2017. From March of 2017 through late April of 2017, there was a sporadic period of reported incidents. Then they stopped, and then 2 additional reports happened in close proximity in August of last year. They were medically confirmed in September. These are the facts that will be testified to today by our panel, and with that I turn to the ranking member. Thank you. Dr. Rosenfarb, I'll start with you. Is it fair to say that by May 1st, you said you saw the confirmed cases February through April of 2017, is it fair to say that by May 1st or early May, we were aware that at least 16 U.S. government employees and or dependents had suffered a serious injury while working in Havana for the U.S. government?
Senator, it's fair to say that we were aware that 16 people had suffered some type of injury. As I said,
But was it serious?
In some individuals, the symptoms were more serious than others. There was a
Was-
whole spectrum of symptoms that we saw and findings as well.
Let me ask you this. Was there a single, of the 16, at least one U.S. government employee working at Havana suffered serious injury? Is it fair to say at least one suffered serious injury?
I would say many suffered serious injury.
And let me tell you why I asked
anything.
you that. Because, Mr. Palmieri, according to the law, in any case of serious injury related to a U.S. government mission abroad, the Secretary of State shall convene an accountability or review board. The law allows that has to happen within 60 days of the occurrence of an incident, and it allows for a 60-day delay if the Secretary determines that additional period is necessary for the convening of the board. So, by my calculation, if by early May we knew that at least one, if not several, as Dr. Rosenfarb has testified, suffered serious injury, by early July on the 60-day period, and certainly by early September, if you run the whole 120-day period, an accountability review board should have been set up. I got a letter on November 6th saying that there was still not an accountability review board, that the Secretary had decided to delay for 60 days in order to determine whether one was even necessary. It says, allow additional time for the investigation to yield more information to better inform the decision of whether to convene an ARB. Has an accountability review board been set up as of this date? And why was it not set up, as according to law, within the 120-day period?
Senator, thank you for that question. The Secretary has made a decision to convene an accountability review board. There will be a congressional notification sent shortly.
Why was it not done within 120 days of May 1st when we knew that there was serious injury?
Throughout this process, there's been a lot of information that we knew or at times was then later contradicted. Throughout this process, we've not been able to identify who the perpetrator of such attack was and what the means of that attack was. It was only until late August when there was another round of attacks that it became apparent to us that we should begin the process of looking at an accountability review board.
Well, that's not what the law reads. It says, in any case of serious injury, loss of life, et cetera, related to a United States government mission abroad, it does not say that you need to know who did it. In fact, that's one of the reasons for an accountability review board. The bottom line is the State Department did not follow the law in setting one up within the 120-day period, in my opinion, and I believe in the opinion of others, given the fact that by early May we knew serious injury had occurred to U.S. personnel and their dependents related to their service and government mission abroad. It wasn't one person, it was several people, as has been testified here. Now, we first heard of the complaints in late 2016, and Mr. Brown, you testified the conclusion was that this was forces hostile to the United States and or hostile to our presence in Cuba. Is that correct?
That's correct. Initially, we felt that it was a form of harassment, and that was attributed to the government.
Mr.
Yes.
Palmieri, do you know when Secretary Kerry was made aware? This was the State Department conclusion that there was harassment, correct?
Yes, sir. That was the early opinion of the security professionals who looked at it, that it was likely a form of harassment.
Okay. When was Secretary Kerry made aware? Do you know?
I do not know. I'll have to check the record, Senator.
Do you know if President Obama was ever made aware?
I know that as a regular matter, we would have apprised the National Security Council at some point after the late December information became apparent.
What about Secretary Tillerson? When was he first made aware?
I would believe that would have been in late February, sir.
Okay. Do you know if the Trump transition team was made aware during the transition period?
I did not have contact with them on this issue. I'm not aware if anyone else did, sir.
Now, in December 2014, when President Obama changed policy towards Cuba, we set up the embassy. We had to expand personnel, did we not, in Havana? We added personnel to expand the mission.
I would have to go back to check the record, but yes, that probably makes sense.
And we also had to secure housing. And we provided, so we had to secure housing for the additional mission in Havana.
That would be normal practice, yes, Senator.
And in Cuba, we would have to provide the Cuban government the list of all of the U.S. government employees that were moving to Havana to work at the mission. That's just a matter of course, correct?
But we would have solicited visas for the additional personnel, yes.
And the residences in Cuba, since there is no real private property, all of these residents would have been owned by the Cuban government.
That's my understanding too, sir.
The hotels where these attacks happened were owned by the Cuban government, that's for sure.
That's correct.
Okay. What security measures did we take, Mr. Brown, in this expansion on these residences?
Senator, I mean, to talk a little bit about residential security, I think historically, from a crime perspective, political violence perspective, there were not features sort of related to that. Our concern, and I believe the Cuban government selected, was aware of which housing our personnel would go into. Our housing profile is fairly compact. There are not specific security measures in a high CI, in a counterintelligence type environment. So there wouldn't have been any other physical security in relation to the residences that were in place, other than the location, and certainly based on a history in Cuba, we did not have, beyond the harassment element, we did not have, you know, a high crime statistics or anything related to political violence. So there wouldn't have been any residential measures taken above and beyond what was already in place.
Okay, my final question is for you, Mr. Brown, and you, Dr. Rosenfarb. Based on what we know, and more importantly, what we don't know, can you today guarantee the safety of any personnel in Havana currently stationed there or about to be deployed to Havana? Do we know what they can do to protect themselves from these sorts of injuries? Can we guarantee that today, if we send someone there, they are safe from these injuries?
Senator, I don't think we can say categorically that we can guarantee that they would be safe from this. Certainly, not knowing what's causing it or who's behind it or how it's being done gives us very little in the terms of mitigation. What we have done is address sort of being sure that our community in Havana is well aware of what has happened, to provide advice on how to respond to that, to have teams in place that then can respond and how to report those types of incidents. So we have done a lot of work in terms of elevating the knowledge of the personnel that are
But I guess
there.
to cut to the chase, Mr. Brown, if I were being deployed to Havana today to work in the embassy, and I asked you, what can I do to protect myself from the sort of thing that have happened, you do not know what I can do to protect myself, since we don't know what it is they use to attack them.
That's true, Senator. Our guidance would be, in the event of something similar that what has taken place, to react in a certain manner. That's a reactive measure, not a mitigation.
Dr. Rosenfarb, do you have any advice for people that are being deployed to Havana, how they can protect themselves from this?
Well, we try and educate those who have to go down there for government business and make sure they're aware of the risk and make sure they're aware of what we know about the symptoms that have occurred. As far as we know right now, the only mitigation factor is to limit your exposure. We inform people that should they hear or feel a sensation, to move away as quickly as possible. We know from our patients already who've been there that the less exposure, the better. We also do pre-deployment screening now to ascertain baseline hearing, baseline cognitive function. So should they report any concern whatsoever, we're able to measure what they're currently at compared to the previous status and get them the help they need.
The ranking member. Thank you. And any other members appear, I'll just kind of try to wrap up the loose ends, and I'll take off with what Senator Udall said there at the end, and that is jumping to conclusions. That's why I thought the important part of this hearing is to kind of lay out the facts, okay? I read this headline a couple days ago. It said FBI rules out sonic attacks, and saw some other things out there about it. And so you read that and you could conclude that nothing happened. That in essence, you know, I saw at one point the Cuban government said that it could be crickets or some insect noise, cicadas, is that what they're, yeah. I didn't even know there were cicadas. Well, I don't know, we don't have that problem in Miami, but you have them? Yeah. A lot of concussive effects after? No?
They drive you crazy.
All right, well, yeah. But my point is that you could read that headline and conclude that that means that nothing happened. That's the method by which the attack, there has not been a definitive, we cannot definitively sit here today and say, this is the machine or this is the thing they used to cause these injuries, okay? And no one here has claimed that we know that. What I think is not in dispute is that there are 24 Americans who either work for the U.S. government or were there as a dependent of a U.S. government employee who during their time in Havana have experienced symptoms that are consistent with what you would see in mild traumatic brain injury and/or concussion. That is an established fact that we've talked about today. We may not know how they came to that point, but we know it happened to them, and we know it happened to 24 people while they were working in Havana. Dr. Rosenfarb, let me ask you, is there any thought given to the fact that this is a case of mass hysteria, that a bunch of people are just being hypochondriacs and making it up?
Well, as you said, Senator, 24 people have had symptoms and findings consistent with what looks like a mild traumatic brain injury. The objective tests that were done were not ones that could basically easily faked. There are exact findings that our experts have determined. That being said, no etiology, no cause has been fully ruled out, and we're looking. Their doctors are looking at everything, but the findings suggest that this is not an episode of mass hysteria.
And so what we know for a fact is that 24 Americans that were in Havana on either related to or on government business for a significant period of time, have come back with these symptoms. That is a fact. So when people are out there reporting about sonic attack ruled out, perhaps the sonic part of it has been ruled out, but the fact that people, if that's even true, by the way, I'm not saying that's just what the headline said, but the fact that this has happened, that people have been hurt, that is established fact. Does anyone on the panel dispute that people have been hurt while working in Havana on behalf of the U.S. government? Okay. So then the second question becomes, what's our role here in oversight? And I know we're starting to play some word games here, but I think this is really important because this is an oversight committee, okay? And our job is to conduct oversight over the Department of State. Here's what we know. I know what the law says. The law says in the case of any serious injury related to a U.S. government mission abroad, the Secretary of State shall convene an accountability board. It doesn't say in case of any permanent injury. It says in the case of any serious injury. And I know, given all the attention being paid to concussions as an example, because of football and other things, that concussions are considered serious injury. And I would say that to anyone in the world, if I told you I'm going to cause you to have mild traumatic brain injury, you would think that's serious, whether it's permanent or not. That's what the law says. We know that these complaints came in by late 2016, there were visits to the medical unit in late December of 16 and throughout 17. We know that they were serious enough that by mid-February we approached the Cuban government about it. We know that in the early stages after this occurred, it was the opinion of both the leadership at the post in Havana and in the supporting office in Washington that this was likely some form of harassment by forces hostile to the United States or our presence in Cuba. That was the assessment made at that time. We know that in late April, or certainly by early May, we had 16 people that we could identify with symptoms and medically verifiable clinical findings similar to, as I said earlier, mild traumatic brain injury or concussion. We know that by September 29th, we ordered the departure of non-emergency personnel. All these things happened, and yet we know that by October, certainly by November 6th of this year, an ARB was still not up and running. So if you just do the math on the calendar, these facts that I just laid out, extrapolated backwards, should have led to the appointment. And I understand there was a transition, and I understand there was a change in administration, but we should have had an accountability review board in place, or some notification given as to why it's no longer necessary. Of course, since then, the decision's been made. And where are we, by the way, Mr. Palmieri, in the accountability review period? Are we now in the active? Has it now, when was it stood up? When was the accountability review board activated?
The Secretary took a decision to form an accountability review board on December 11th. I believe a congressional notification will arrive shortly, and that is required before the board is actually constituted, Senator.
So on December 11th, okay, well, I can tell you that's more than 120 days from all these facts, which I think lead to the argument that we should have had. Now, because we don't know how these attacks were conducted, suffice it to say, let me ask this, Dr. Rosenfarb and Mr. Brown, and this would never happen, but if someone in the U.S. government says, we want to cause these symptoms in people, that technology doesn't exist. We don't know of that technology. Is that accurate? We are not aware of a technology that does this. We've never seen a technology anywhere in the world that does this to people.
That's my understanding, Senator, when going to the subject matter experts in both in government and outside government, we have not seen this.
Dr. Rosenfarb, have you ever seen cases of this outside of an actual blow to the head or something similar?
I have not.
Okay, and that's consistent with everything we've been told, is that, and the reason why I raise that is because obviously this is a pretty sophisticated thing. Okay, this was not something conducted by, a fly-by-night operation. Whatever happened to these people happened as a result of some sophisticated technology that, quite frankly, is so sophisticated we don't understand it. So it leads you then, so you have a sophisticated attack of some sort causing these injuries. We don't know who possesses that sophisticated material, but we know that it's pretty sophisticated, leading you to believe it's a nation state, someone who can afford this kind of thing. And then it leads you down the road of motivation. And I think it's fair to say, and I think most members of this committee would argue as well, and I think many of you would probably share this view, that whoever did this because they wanted there to be friction between the United States and the Cuban government. That would be the motivation behind this. Someone who wanted to cause friction between the U.S. and the Cuban government, particularly if you look at the timing of these attacks, November, December 2016, after the election. So it makes you start to think, who would do this? Someone who doesn't like our presence there and someone who wants there to be this sort of friction between the U.S. So who would be motivated to create friction, or who would not be in favor of an increased U.S. presence in Cuba? Well, the first, obviously, is opponents of U.S. Cuba opening under the Obama administration. I don't think any credible person on the planet believes that some group of anti-Castro Cubans conducted these attacks in an elaborate scheme to somehow disrupt the Obama opening. So I don't even want to spend any time on that. Unless anyone here thinks that that's a viable option, I assure you it is not. The second is a rogue element within the Cuban government itself. And it's interesting, I was reading this Associated Press report, and it talks about the initial reaction. Now, maybe this isn't accurate, but on September 15th, the Associated Press reported that in a rare face-to-face conversation, Castro told U.S. diplomat Jerry De Laurentiis that he was baffled and he was concerned, and he denied any responsibility, but U.S. officials were caught off guard by the way he addressed the matter, devoid of the indignant, how dare you accuse us attitude the U.S. had come to expect from Cuba's leaders. It would also say his government didn't dispute that something troubling may have gone down on Cuban soil. Now, subsequently, that's not the position they've taken, but this is what the article reports. This suggests to me that potentially Castro is aware of rogue elements within his own government that may have been behind this, because whether you want to call them hardliners or people that feel they just don't, they feel like they'd be in a stronger position if this opening had not occurred, or if this increased U.S. presence, perhaps people concerned about an increased U.S. presence in light of the planned transition that theoretically is supposed to take place at some point this year. So I'm not asking you for anything classified, because I don't think such a thing would be classified. But Mr. Palmieri, at any point in time, have we ever seen reports from any of our diplomats in Cuba that suggest that Raul Castro or anyone around him has ever said to us, it wasn't us, but it could have been someone within us who did this? Has Raul Castro ever said to any U.S. diplomat, I didn't do it, but it's possible that some of my guys did it without me knowing about it?
I do not believe that communication has ever occurred.
Is that your answer because you don't want to discuss something that is not in the proper setting, or is that just you just have never heard that?
That is my recollection, that I've never heard that. But we can check the diplomatic record and see if there was any exchange like that. I do not believe so.
Okay. And then the last one, and this was a question that was, then you say, well, if it wasn't a rogue element within the Castro government, maybe it was a third country. Which third country would want to disrupt the U.S. presence there? And the logical conclusion is Russia and Vladimir Putin. During the Cold War, do we have any documented cases of similar attacks against individuals anywhere in the world?
I'm not aware, Senator, of anything similar to this. No, sir.
I believe in the late 50s and 60s, there were some evidence that microwave beams or radiation was directed against the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, and I think it stopped in 1975, 1976.
So there were some microwave attacks against the U.S. diplomatic presence in Moscow between some point in the 1950s through the mid-1970s.
Senator, I'm not knowledgeable enough to say whether there were attacks or not, but I know they were investigating excess levels of microwave radiation that people may have been subjected to back in that time frame.
Mr. Palmieri, you were asked by, I believe, Senator Menendez if this had ever been raised with the Russian government, and your answer was you couldn't answer that in that setting. Why would a communication to a foreign government, unless it contained, sensitive information, be classified? In essence, is it typical that any sort of communication with a foreign government, because we're aware that, for example, that we've addressed this with the Cuban government, why would the fact or lack of existence of a communication to the Russian government be something that we can't discuss in public?
Because of the nature of an interagency discussion, to give the context to give you the full reply would be required, and I believe that would be more appropriate in the classified setting.
And then I think that the last point that I think is pretty clear here is that it's important for us not to ascribe to Havana attributes of New York or Washington, D.C. Cuba, by all accounts, is by far the most heavily monitored and surveilled country in the Western Hemisphere. Does anyone disagree with that assessment? It is a police state. Does anyone disagree with the assessment that the city of Havana is the most monitored and surveilled city within the island of Cuba? I think that's, and then let me ask you, U.S. government personnel, if you are an employee of the United States government and you are going to Havana, what level of monitoring or surveillance should you expect when you are positioned there? What do we tell our people when they go? Just outside of this context, do they have free reign to do anything they want, or should they expect that they are constantly being watched, monitored, and closely kept tabs on? Mr. Brown, I think that's probably.
Senator, I don't want to go into too much detail in an unclassified.
Yeah, don't tell me the methods. I just want to know what
But certainly we prepare our personnel for levels of surveillance and levels of harassment, and movements are certainly restricted, and movements are anticipated that there will be a Cuban element monitoring those movements.
What other post in the world would you say is comparable to the level of surveillance, history of harassment that a U.S. government employee would find in Havana? What other places in the world have similar attributes?
Senator, I think we're getting close to some classified areas, and I would hesitate to compare.
I'm not asking you again for the type of harassment or even the type of surveillance, but I think it's classified to say that
The ranking of the level of counterintelligence is a classified area.
But I'm not asking for the ranking. I'm just saying who compares to, is it like it is in Montreal or Quebec?
It is not.
Okay. So then the reason why I'm asking this is because if I think it's safe to conclude that if I'm a U.S. government employee working in the embassy in Havana, the Cuban government knows where I live and is probably watching me every single day. The idea that somehow someone could conduct an attack so sophisticated that we don't even know what it is, without the Cuban government at least knowing about it, to one U.S. government employee, not to mention 24 over a 12-month period, is outside the realm of reasonable. It's ridiculous. I could understand if somebody was mugged on a street corner, but these are sophisticated attacks, so sophisticated, as I said, that we can't even describe how it happened yet, to 24 U.S. government employees and their dependents in the most heavily monitored city, in the most heavily monitored country in the Western Hemisphere, and among the most heavily monitored in the world, where U.S. government personnel in particular are watched very carefully for all of their movements and activities. And the idea that someone could put together some sort of action against them, 24 of them, and the Cuban government not see it or know about it, it's just not possible. And so it leads you to conclude that the Cuban government either did this or they know who did it. And they can't say because whoever did it is either a third-party country that they cannot take on, or elements within their own regime that they do not want to reveal for purposes of not making it appear to be unstable internally. And so I think these are all good conclusions from this hearing that conclude by saying my admonition at the beginning. I think it's really unfair for any suggestion that people working on behalf of the U.S. government were not injured in Havana. Imagine if you were one of these people who were out there working on our behalf, who have now suffered from these injuries, and reading in a newspaper somewhere that what happened to you didn't happen. Not only is it demoralizing, I think it's incredibly unfair to them. We can say that we don't know how it happened. We can even say we can't know for sure who did it. But two things we know for sure. People were hurt, and the Cuban government knows who did it. They just won't say for some reason. And I think that's the biggest takeaway from this hearing, other than I remain concerned about the State Department's unwillingness to stand up the ARB, the Accountability Review Board, in a timely fashion in accordance with the law, and I imagine that will be a topic of further discussion down the road. I think that will conclude my questioning. Seeing no other members, did you have anything else, Senator Udall? Well, I want to thank all of you for being here. I know this is a unique and perplexing subject matter, something we haven't really seen. Let me just get we're going to have you're probably going to, Senator Menendez already indicated, and I think some other members, Senator Flake had to leave. This is a topic he cares about a lot, but he had to be at the White House as well as Senator Menendez on an immigration meeting, so they had to leave, but both of them have indicated they're going to have extensive questions for the record, and so we're going to keep the record open for 48 hours, and I'd ask that their questions be answered in a timely fashion so that we can close out this hearing and have all that information. I also ask that my questions that remain unanswered, when was Secretary Kerry notified, when was President Obama notified, and whether the Trump transition was briefed on this topic, also be taken back for the record. I think these are important questions to have answers for. And seeing no other members here, nothing else further, the meeting is adjourned.